I took the night shift because it looked like the kind of problem you could solve with math. That was the story I told myself the first time I circled the listing at 3 in the morning. The apartment dark, the fridge louder than it should have been, my bank app open on my phone like a quiet accusation. 42 hours a week at a rate that didn't belong to a grocery store job. Hazard pay, the listing said, which was a strange word to use for stocking shelves and running a register. But money has a way of smoothing out strange words until they feel almost reasonable. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was simple. I told myself that if I could just hold steady long enough, everything else would follow. My brother stopped answering my calls 2 weeks before I applied. Not out of anger, out of exhaustion. There's a particular kind of silence people adopt when they're tired of explaining the same problem without solving it. And I had been giving him that problem for months. Rent behind, credit cards maxed, a car that needed more than I could afford to give it. He'd helped where he could until help started to feel like a leak instead of a fix. The last thing he said before the silence set in was, "You need something stable." I agreed with him. I just hadn't known where to find it. The listing had an address, but no company name. Night associate, remote location, inventory and register management. Must follow operational guidelines without deviation. The phrase "without deviation" was in bold, which felt unnecessary for a job that on paper involved counting boxes and scanning items. There was also a line about a required in-person orientation. No phone screening, no email follow-up, just a date, a time, and a set of coordinates that led 30 minutes past the last place my map app felt confident about. I drove out on a Tuesday because it was the soonest available slot. The city thinned into warehouses, then into stretches of road that looked like they had been built with the assumption that not many people would need them. The signal dropped in pieces. One bar, then none, then a brief flicker like the phone reconsidering before giving up entirely. By the time I reached the final turn, the sky had that flat, late afternoon color that makes distances harder to judge. The store appeared without much warning. No neighboring buildings, no competing signs. Just a rectangular structure with a parking lot that had more space than it needed and fewer cars than it should have had. The sign above the entrance read "Open" in steady white letters, not blinking, not flickering, just on. Inside, it looked like any other grocery store that had been assembled from familiar parts and then left alone long enough for small differences to settle in. The aisles were clean. The shelves were stocked. The fluorescent lights hummed at a pitch that sat just behind comfortable hearing. There were no customers. There was a man behind the register who looked up as I walked in, not surprised, not welcoming, just aware. "You're early," he said. "I wasn't sure about the drive," I answered. He nodded once, like that had been the correct response. "Good. Early is useful." He didn't ask for my name. He didn't offer his. He stepped out from behind the counter and motioned toward a door marked "Staff Only." I followed because that was the point of being there, and because something about the way he moved suggested that not following would have been a decision I'd have to explain. The back room was smaller than I expected, and more organized than it needed to be. A desk, a chair, a set of monitors mounted in a grid showing different angles of the store. The camera feeds were steady, no static, no lag, each one labeled in small white text at the corner. Aisle 1, Aisle 2, register, entrance, storage, hallway, rear door. The last one showed a metal door with 3 locks and a horizontal bar across it. The man sat and folded his hands. "The job is straightforward," he said. "You will work nights. You will manage the register. You will restock as needed. You will follow the rules." "What kind of rules?" I asked. He reached into the desk and placed a binder in front of me. It was thick enough to feel like more than a formality, and worn enough to suggest it had been used by more than a few people before me. "Operational," he said. "Memorize them. Follow them exactly. There is no flexibility." I opened the binder. The The first page had a list, numbered, 8 entries, each one written in plain language that became less plain the longer you looked at it. Rule 1. At 11:07 p.m., the entrance chime will sound once. Do not look at the door until it sounds a second time. Rule 2. Between 12:20 a.m. and 12:40 a.m., avoid aisle 4 entirely. If you are in it when the lights dim, remain still until they return to full brightness. Rule 3. If a customer requests an item that is not visible on the shelves, retrieve the blue package from under the counter and place it on the register. Do not open it. Rule 4. At exactly 1:33 a.m., a cart may appear in the center of the store. Do not move it. Rule 5. If you smell something burning and cannot locate a source, lock the storage room and remain at the register. Rule 6. If you hear your name spoken from the rear hallway, do not respond. Activate the intercom switch beneath the counter. Rule 7. The rear door remains closed at all times. No exceptions. Rule 8. At 4:12 a.m., leave the store through the front entrance and do not look back. I read through them once, then again. The wording was precise in a way that made each sentence feel like it had been adjusted until nothing unnecessary remained. "This is a test?" I asked. "No," he said. "It's the job." "Why the hazard pay?" He considered that for a moment, not like he was deciding what to say, but like he was selecting from answers that already existed. "Because some people find it difficult to follow instructions when they matter." "And if I don't?" I asked. "Then you won't be here long," he said, in the same tone you'd use to explain store hours or return policies. I did the math again, not on paper this time, but in the quiet way your mind balances risk against necessity. Rent, debt, time. The numbers didn't change just because the rules were strange. They just made the decision feel heavier. "When do I start?" I asked. "Tonight," he said. He slid the binder back toward me, and I took it because I had already decided, even if I was still pretending I hadn't. The rules sat in my hands with a weight that didn't come from paper. I told myself it was manageable. I told myself that following instructions was the simplest part of any job. I told myself that whatever made those rules necessary could be handled the same way everything else was handled, one step at a time, without deviation. That was the last simple thought I had before the first shift began. I arrived at 9:42 p.m., earlier than necessary and aware of it, but the drive had trained me to leave margins where I could. The parking lot was empty, except for a single car I recognized as his, positioned in a way that suggested permanence rather than convenience. The open sign was already lit, the same steady white as before, indifferent to whether anyone was there to read it. I sat in my car for a minute with the engine off, listening to the ticking sound it made as it cooled, and went over the rules again without opening the binder. I had read them enough times that they were starting to settle into place, not as information, but as reflex. Inside, nothing had changed, and that was the first thing that felt intentional. The same arrangement of products, the same quiet hum, the same absence of customers. He was behind the counter again, hands resting lightly on the surface, watching the entrance like it was a point on a map he needed to keep track of. "You're on time," he said. "Early," I corrected. He nodded once. "That helps." There was no formal handoff, no paperwork, no introduction to systems or procedures beyond what the binder had already given me. He stepped aside, and I took his place behind the register, because that was the shape the moment suggested. The screen lit up when I touched it, an older interface, but functional, simple enough to learn in minutes. "I'll be in the office," he said, gesturing toward the back. "You'll hear the intercom if I need you." "What should I do if I need you?" I asked. "You won't," he said, and left it there. I stood alone behind the counter with the store laid out in front of me, and the rules arranged in my head, like a checklist I couldn't afford to get wrong. The first hour passed quietly. I stocked a section near the register, aligning items so the labels faced forward, counting without needing to write it down. It felt like any other job at that point, repetitive in a way that usually settled my thoughts. At 10:58 p.m., I found myself looking at the clock more often than the shelves. Not out of fear exactly, but anticipation sharpened by the knowledge that something specific was about to happen. Rule 1 had a time attached to it. That made it different from the others, predictable in a way that should have been reassuring. At 11:06, I moved behind the counter and positioned myself facing the register, not the door. The placement felt deliberate, like setting up for something you'd already decided to go through with. My hands rested lightly on the surface, and I focused on a small scratch near the edge of the counter, giving my eyes somewhere to settle that wasn't the entrance. 11:07 p.m. The chime sounded once. It was a clean tone, the kind you'd hear in any store, but it carried longer than it should have, stretching just enough to make you aware of it after it should have ended. I kept my eyes on the counter. The instinct to look up was immediate and specific. Not curiosity, but reaction. You hear a door, you check it. That's the normal sequence. Interrupting it took effort. I counted in my head without deciding to. 1, 2, 3, steady and even. Something to occupy the space where the instinct would otherwise go. The air shifted slightly behind me, a change I felt more than heard, like the room had adjusted to account for something new in it. The second chime didn't come right away. That was the part that made the rule feel necessary. I kept counting. 10, 15, 20. My shoulders tightened without me noticing until I made a point of relaxing them. The store remained quiet in front of me, the hum of the lights, the faint vibration of the refrigerator units. Ordinary sounds that felt less stable with something unaccounted for behind me. At 32, the chime sounded again. Shorter this time, normal. I waited a few seconds longer because the rule didn't specify how quickly I could move after the second sound, and guessing felt like a risk I didn't need. Then, I turned. The entrance was closed. The glass reflected the interior lights, showing me a version of the store that looked unchanged. No one stood near the door. No one moved in the aisles. The parking lot beyond was empty. I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath. Good, the intercom clicked, his voice coming through with a flat clarity. You followed it. There was nothing in the rules about answering him. And I was already learning that adding anything unnecessary to a system like this was a mistake. The next hour passed with a different texture. The normalcy had been adjusted. The rules weren't theoretical anymore. They had produced an outcome, even if that outcome was the absence of something visible. At 12:18 a.m., I moved away from aisle 4 without needing to check the time again. The clock sat at the edge of my awareness, and I trusted it enough to act on it. I stayed near the register, organizing small items, keeping my movements contained. At 12:23, the lights in aisle 4 dimmed. Not flickering, not failing, dimming, smoothly and deliberately, like someone had turned a dial. I didn't look directly at it. Peripheral vision was enough to confirm the change. The rest of the store remained bright. The contrast made the darker aisle feel separate, like a space that had been set aside for something I wasn't meant to engage with. I stood still. The instruction was simple. Remain still until they returned to full brightness. It didn't say anything about breathing, about blinking, about shifting weight. I interpreted still as broadly as possible, minimizing movement without locking myself into something unsustainable. Time stretched in a way that made counting unreliable. The dim light held steady. There was a sense of motion within it, not visible in a way I could describe, but present enough that my body registered it as something to pay attention to. I didn't. At what I later realized was 12:40, the lights returned to normal. Not gradually, immediately, full brightness, as if nothing had changed. I let my shoulders drop, the tension releasing in a controlled way that felt practiced, even though it wasn't. 2 rules followed, 2 outcomes that matched the instructions. It would have been easy at that point to believe the rest would be just as manageable. That was the assumption the night was waiting for. By 12:50 a.m., the store had settled into a rhythm that felt almost cooperative, like it had accepted my presence for the moment, and was allowing me to exist inside it without interference. That feeling didn't last, but it stayed long enough to become a reference point for everything that came after. I restocked the cooler near the front, aligning bottles by label, counting without writing, keeping my movements small and deliberate. The rules were no longer abstract. They had edges now, and I could feel where they began and ended, even when nothing was actively happening. At 1:12 a.m., the first customer arrived. The chime sounded once, then again, both times normal. I turned immediately, because there was no rule preventing it now, and saw a man stepping inside with a kind of slow, measured pace that suggested he wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. He wore a dark jacket despite the temperature, zipped halfway up, and his eyes moved across the store without settling on anything in particular. "Evening," I said, "because that's what you say." He didn't respond, not ignoring me exactly, more like the word hadn't reached whatever part of him processed conversation. He walked to the center aisle, paused, then changed direction without any visible reason, and approached the counter. Up close, there was nothing overtly wrong about him. Late 30s maybe, clean, tired in a way that looked familiar. But there was a flatness to his expression that made it hard to tell where his attention actually was. "I need something," he said. His voice was steady, but it lacked the small variations that usually come with speech. No emphasis, no shift. "What are you looking for?" I asked. He held my gaze for a moment, then said, "It's not on the shelves." Rule 3. I didn't ask a follow-up question. The binder had been clear about that. I crouched, opened the compartment beneath the register, and found the blue package exactly where it was supposed to be. Rectangular, sealed, no markings. It felt lighter than it looked. I placed it on the counter between us. He reached out, took it without inspecting it, and set down a few bills. More than the cost of anything in the store. I didn't correct him. There was no rule about change in this situation, and introducing one felt like a mistake. "Thank you," he said, with the same flat delivery. Then he turned and left. The chime sounded once, then again. I watched the door close behind him, and waited a few seconds before moving. The money remained on the counter. I placed it in the register, without counting it. The blue package was gone. At 1:33 a.m., I was behind the counter, hands resting lightly on the surface, when I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A shopping cart stood in the center of the store. I hadn't heard it enter. The chime hadn't sounded. It was just there, positioned precisely between two aisles, angled slightly toward the entrance, like it had been left mid-decision. Rule 4, do not move it. I didn't. I watched it for longer than I needed to, not because I intended to act, but because the presence of something unexplained invites attention. The cart didn't move. No wheels shifted. No item sat inside it. It was empty, and that made it feel more deliberate, not less. I turned away first. At 1:50, I found myself listening more than working. The store had layers of sound I hadn't noticed before. The hum of the lights wasn't constant. It fluctuated in small ways, rising and falling, just enough to suggest a pattern, without revealing one. The refrigeration units clicked on and off, at intervals that didn't align with each other. The building itself made small settling noises, the kind you'd expect in any structure, but spaced in a way that kept them from blending into the background. At 2:07 a.m., the smell started. It was faint at first, something like overheated wiring or burnt dust. I paused, letting it register fully before acting, because the rule was specific about one thing: if you smell something burning and cannot locate a source. I stepped out from behind the counter and walked to the nearest aisle, scanning for anything obvious. No smoke, no visible heat. The smell intensified slightly as I moved, but it didn't lead anywhere. It was consistent, evenly distributed, not stronger in one place than another. I returned to the register. Rule 5. I moved to the storage room door, closed it, and turned the lock. The click sounded louder than expected. Final. Back at the counter, I stood with my hands resting where they had been before, posture neutral, breathing steady. The smell lingered for a few minutes, then faded as gradually as it had appeared. No alarm. No consequence that I could see. At 2:40, the cart was gone. I didn't see it leave. I just noticed its absence, the way you notice a missing object after you've stopped actively thinking about it. One moment it was part of the layout. The next, it wasn't. That left 3 rules. By the time 3 o'clock approached, I had started to understand something that hadn't been written in the binder, but was implied by everything in it. The rules weren't there to explain the store. They were there to define how much of it you were allowed to interact with and survive. At 3:08 a.m., I heard my name. Not loudly, not from any specific direction, just present, like it had been placed into the space behind me with care. Daniel. My body reacted before my thoughts did. A slight shift, a tightening in my shoulders, the beginning of a turn that I stopped before it completed. The voice was familiar, not in a way I could immediately place, but close enough to trigger recognition. Rule 6. Do not respond. The second part followed without hesitation. I reached beneath the counter and pressed the intercom switch. A low, steady noise filled the store. Not quite static, not quite silence. Something in between that flattened the space and made it harder to distinguish individual sounds. The voice came again, just at the edge of hearing. Daniel, I need you. It was clearer that time. I kept my eyes on the register, focusing on the reflection of the overhead lights in its surface, giving myself a fixed point to hold on to. The intercom noise continued, unchanging, a barrier more than a solution. Daniel, closer. I didn't answer. The sound shifted, not louder, but nearer in a way that didn't match distance. The kind of closeness that ignores space. Then it stopped. Not fading, ending. The intercom clicked off a few seconds later. I hadn't touched it again. The store returned to its previous state, the layered sounds reassembling themselves into something that felt almost normal by comparison. I exhaled slowly, aware of the tension in my hands, the way my fingers had pressed into the edge of the counter without me noticing. One rule left. At 4:10 a.m., I prepared to leave. I counted the register, not because I needed to, but because routine provided structure. I checked the aisles without stepping too far into them, confirming nothing had changed in ways I hadn't noticed. The storage room remained locked. The rear door, visible on the monitor, stayed closed. At 4:12, I stepped out from behind the counter, walked to the entrance, and pushed the door open. The chime sounded once. Cool air met me from outside, clean in a way that felt different from the controlled environment inside. I stepped into it, crossed the threshold, and let the door close behind me. I did not look back. I slept through most of the day without meaning to, the kind of sleep that feels less like rest and more like your body forcing a reset, while your mind tries to keep up. When I woke up, it was late afternoon, the light outside already starting to thin into evening. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I worked. Then it came back all at once, not as a sequence of events, but as a set of rules, each one slotting into place with the same clarity it had the night before. What surprised me wasn't fear, it was the absence of it. There had been moments during the shift where something close to it surfaced, but it never fully formed. The rules had contained it, given it boundaries. Follow this, don't do that, stand here, stay still. As long as I stayed inside those lines, nothing had actually happened to me. That was the logic my mind settled on, clean and efficient. I checked my phone out of habit. No missed calls, no messages. The world outside the store had continued without interruption, which made the store itself feel more isolated than it had the night before. Not just physically distant, but separate in a way that didn't quite fit into normal categories. I ate something simple, drank more coffee than I needed, and left earlier than necessary again. The drive felt shorter this time, not because the distance had changed, but because I knew what waited at the end of it. Familiarity compresses space like that. The parking lot was empty when I arrived. That was new. The night before, his car had been there, a fixed point that suggested oversight, structure. Now there was nothing. Just the building, the sign, the same steady open. I sat in my car a moment longer than usual, watching the entrance like I expected something to change if I gave it enough time. Nothing did. Inside, the store looked the same. The lights, the aisles, the register. Empty. "Hello?" I called. Not loudly. No answer. I moved behind the counter slowly. Not because I was afraid, but because the absence of the man from the night before removed the layer I hadn't realized I was relying on. He had been a constant, even if he hadn't done much. Without him, the rules felt less like instructions and more like something I was choosing to trust on my own. The binder was on the counter where I had left it. I opened it, flipping past the rules to see if anything had changed. Nothing had. Same pages, same wording, same precision. At 9:58 p.m., the intercom clicked. "You're on your own tonight," his voice said. Flat, distant, as if it were coming from somewhere further away than the office in the back. "Where are you?" I asked before I could stop myself. A brief pause. "Monitoring," he said. "Follow the rules." The line went dead. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, the silence settling in a way that felt heavier than it had the night before. Then I closed the binder and placed it back on the counter, exactly where it had been. The shift began the same way. 10:30 passed quietly. 10:50. The routine established itself again, stocking, organizing, keeping movement minimal. The difference was internal. Without someone else in the building, every sound felt closer. Every small shift more noticeable. At 11:06, I positioned myself behind the counter, eyes on the register, body aligned with the rule. 11:07. The chime sounded once. This time, the reaction came faster. Not the instinct to turn, but the decision not to. It felt practiced already, like something I had done more than once, even though I hadn't. I counted again. 1, 2, 3. The air shifted behind me. This time there was something else with it. A faint movement. Not sound exactly, more like the suggestion of it, just outside the range where it would become something I could identify. I kept counting. At 20, the sense of presence felt closer than it had the night before. Not physically measurable, but defined enough that my body responded to it as if it were. 30. The second chime hadn't sounded yet. 35. The urge to turn wasn't curiosity. It was correction. Something in me registering that the sequence wasn't matching the previous night, and trying to adjust for it. 42. The chime sounded. Short. Normal. I waited 5 seconds, then turned. The entrance was closed. Empty. The same as before. But the difference stayed with me. The delay had been longer. I didn't write that down. I didn't have anything to write it on, and even if I had, the act of recording it would have made it feel more significant than I was ready to accept. At 12:20, I avoided aisle 4 again. At 12:23, the lights dimmed. This time, I didn't just register the change, I felt it. A pressure, subtle but present, like the air in that section had thickened. I stood still. In my peripheral vision, something shifted within the dim light. Not a shape I could define, not movement I could track, but not nothing. The instruction didn't say anything about observing, only about movement. I chose not to look. Time stretched again, but this time it carried something with it. A sense of being observed in return, not directly, but enough to register. At 12:40, the lights returned. Full brightness. The pressure lifted. I exhaled slowly, aware of how still I had been, how controlled each breath had become without me consciously deciding it. At 1:12, the chime sounded. Twice. I turned. No one stood at the door. I waited. Nothing entered. No footsteps, no movement. The store remained empty. I stayed behind the counter, watching the entrance longer than I needed to, waiting for something to resolve into a clear outcome. It didn't. At 1:25, I forced myself to look away. At 1:33, the cart appeared again. Same position, same angle. I didn't watch it this time. At 2:05, the smell returned. Stronger. I followed the rule without checking for a source. Storage room locked. Back to the register. The difference was in the timing. Everything was happening slightly off from the night before. Not enough to break the rules, just enough to shift them. At 3:08, I heard my name again. Daniel. Closer. Clearer. I pressed the intercom immediately. The sound filled the store. Daniel, the voice said again, and this time I recognized it. My brother. Not the last version of his voice I had heard on the phone. This was earlier. Calmer. Before things had started to go wrong. Hey, it said. I just wanted to check in. I stared at the register, the reflection of the light steady in its surface. I know you're there. I didn't respond. The voice softened. You don't have to do this alone. The intercom noise continued, flattening the words, but not enough to erase them. Daniel. I held still. The voice stayed for longer this time, repeating variations of the same phrases, each one designed to pull at something familiar, something I had already been thinking about before I came here. Then it stopped, abrupt. The intercom clicked off. The store returned to its baseline state. I didn't move for a long time. At 4:12, I left the store. The chimes sounded once. I stepped outside. The air felt colder than it should have been. I did not look back. But this time, as I walked to my car, I had the distinct sense that something inside had adjusted to me being there. Not reacting. Adapting. By the third night, the job stopped feeling like something I had chosen and started feeling like something I had entered. That difference is subtle until it isn't. Choice implies distance. The ability to step back, reassess, leave if necessary. Entry removes that distance. It places you inside a system that continues whether you participate in it or not. The rules were still the same on paper, but the way they operated had shifted. Not in content, in proximity. I arrived at 9:35 p.m., earlier than before. Not because I needed to be, but because something in me had started to anticipate the timing of things beyond the schedule. The parking lot was still empty, the same wide stretch of unused space, the same absence of any sign that this place functioned like a normal business. Inside, the store greeted me with the same controlled consistency. Lights steady, shelves aligned, air carrying that faint neutral scent of refrigeration and packaging. The binder sat where I had left it. No changes, no additions. The intercom did not activate. I didn't expect it to anymore. I moved behind the counter and placed my hands on the surface, mirroring the position I had taken the previous nights. It felt less like imitation now, and more like alignment, like I was fitting into a shape that had been waiting for me. Time moved. 10:30, 10:50. At 11:06, I was already in position. 11:07. The chime sounded once. I didn't count this time. I didn't need to. The rhythm had settled into something internal, a pacing that matched the structure of the rule without requiring conscious tracking. The air shifted behind me, closer than the second night, present in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. I held still. The second chime took longer. I could feel the delay rather than measure it. When it came, it was sharp, almost corrective. I waited, then turned. The door was closed, but the reflection in the glass was wrong. For a fraction of a second before my mind corrected it, I saw something standing where I should have been reflected. Not detailed, not defined, just an absence shaped like a person, occupying the space my reflection should have filled. Then, it was gone. Just me, the store, the empty entrance. I didn't move closer. I didn't check. The rule had been followed. The outcome, whatever it was, had already occurred. At 12:20, I avoided aisle 4. At 12:23, the lights dimmed. This time, I felt the shift before it happened. A subtle drop in pressure, like the store was preparing for it. I stood still. In the dimmed aisle, something moved with more definition than the previous nights. Not enough to identify, but enough to track. A vertical shape, slightly taller than the shelves, shifting in increments that didn't connect smoothly from one position to the next. I kept my gaze forward. The instinct to look directly had weakened, not disappeared, just reduced to something manageable. At 12:40, the lights returned. I exhaled. At 1:12, the chime sounded twice. I turned. A woman stood just inside the door. She looked normal. That was the first thing that stood out. Mid-20s maybe, hair pulled back, jacket zipped up against the cold. She hesitated just inside, like she was deciding whether she had come to the right place. "Are you open?" she asked. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded normal. That mattered more than I expected. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her, with the usual chime. Her eyes moved across the store, taking in the aisles, the lighting, the layout. There was a brief moment where her expression shifted, like something didn't match what she had expected, but it passed quickly. "Do you have batteries?" she asked. "Back wall," I said, gesturing without leaving the counter. She nodded and walked toward the aisle. I watched her go, not because I needed to, but because something about her presence felt different from the previous customer. More grounded, more connected to the same reality I was in. At 1:25, she returned with a pack in her hand. I scanned it. She placed cash on the counter. "Quiet out here," she said. "It is," I answered. She glanced toward the aisles, then back at me. "You here alone?" "Yes." A small pause. "You ever get the feeling like—" She stopped, reconsidered, then shook her head slightly. "Never mind." I didn't fill the silence. She picked up the batteries. "Have a good night," she said. "You too." She turned and walked to the door. The chime sounded once, then again. She stepped outside. I watched the door close behind her. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then I realized something. She had come in at 1:12. She had left at 1:27. At 1:33, the cart would appear. And she had been in the store before that. The rule didn't say anything about other people. At 1:33, the cart appeared. Same position, same angle. I looked at it, directly, just for a second. Nothing happened, but something changed. Not in the store, in me. The boundary the rules had created, the line between observing and interacting, shifted slightly. Adjusted. At 2:05, the smell came again. I locked the storage room without checking. At 2:40, the cart disappeared. At 3:08, my name came. "Daniel." I pressed the intercom. The noise filled the space. This time, the voice didn't try to convince me. It didn't pretend. It just said my name. Over and over. Different tones, different distances, same word. I stood still. The repetition stripped the meaning from it, turned it into sound instead of language. Then it stopped. At 4:12, I left. The chime sounded once. Outside, the air felt heavier. I walked to my car without looking back. But I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there, hands on the wheel, and looked at the store through the windshield. The lights inside were steady. Nothing moved. It looked like any other place. That was the problem, because I knew it wasn't. And more than that, I knew I was starting to understand it. Not fully, not safely, but enough that the rules didn't feel like instructions anymore. They felt like boundaries. And boundaries, once understood, invite testing. That was the first thought that didn't belong to the version of me who had taken the job for the money. By the fourth night, I stopped pretending I was just following instructions. That doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small permissions you give yourself. A second longer looking at something than you should. A question you don't immediately shut down. A pattern you start tracking instead of avoiding. The rules were still there, unchanged, but my relationship to them had shifted. I wasn't just staying inside them anymore. I was starting to feel where they came from. I arrived at 9:28 p.m. The store was already open. Of course it was. That never changed. Inside, everything held its place with the same quiet precision. The binder, the register, the aisles, the hum. But there was something else now. Not new, just noticeable. Like a background detail that only becomes visible after you've spent enough time in the same room. No distortion. I looked up from the monitor and toward the actual aisle. Normal. Back to the screen. For a moment, less than a second, the lighting in the feed dimmed before returning to normal. The real aisle hadn't changed. I didn't write that down. I went back to the counter. 10:30 passed, 10:50. At 11:06, I was in position. 11:07. The chime sounded once. I didn't count. The air shifted. Closer than it had ever been. There was no ambiguity now. Something stood behind me. Not touching, not moving, just there. The delay stretched. Longer than any previous night. The instinct to turn didn't feel like a mistake anymore. It felt like an option. That was new. The second chime hadn't sounded. I made a decision. Small, controlled. I lifted my eyes slightly. Not turning, not fully breaking the rule, just enough to catch the reflection in the register screen. For a fraction of a second, I saw it. Not a shape, not a person, a distortion. Like the space behind me wasn't aligning correctly, like something was occupying it without fitting into it. Then, the second chime. Sharp, immediate, corrective. I dropped my gaze fully, waited, then turned. The door was closed, the store unchanged, but the line had moved again. At 12:20, I avoided aisle 4. At 12:23, the lights dimmed. This time, I knew exactly where to look without looking directly. Taller than before, slower, deliberate. It paused, not at random, facing the front of the store, facing me. I didn't move. At 12:37, the lights returned. The pressure lifted. At 1:12, the chime sounded. Twice. I turned. No one. I waited. Nothing. At 1:20, the intercom clicked. "You're adjusting," his voice said. I didn't respond. That's when mistakes happen. The line went dead. At 1:33, the card appeared. Same place. I stepped out from behind the counter. That was the first clear break. Not of a rule, but of position. I walked toward it slowly. Each step measured, giving myself time to stop if something felt wrong. Nothing did. I stopped a few feet away. The cart was empty. I reached out and stopped. Not because of the rule, because I understood it. The cart wasn't the problem. Moving it was. I let my hand fall, stepped back, returned to the counter. At 2:05, the smell came, stronger than before. I locked the storage room. As I turned back, I heard something from the rear hallway. Not my name. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Stopping just short of the door. Rule 7. The rear door remains closed. No exceptions. The handle didn't move, but the presence on the other side was clear. Waiting. The register. At 2:40, the cart disappeared. At 3:08, silence. No voice, no name. The absence of it was louder than anything before. At 3:15, the intercom clicked. "It's learns," he said. "What does?" I asked. A pause. "Whatever needs to." The line went dead. At 4:12, I walked to the door. Opened it. Stepped outside. The chime sounded once. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because I understood something now that I hadn't before. The rules weren't there to protect me from the store. They were there to define me within it. To keep me consistent, predictable, understandable. And the moment I started to shift, even slightly, the store adjusted with me. Not against me, with me. I sat in my car, engine off, looking straight ahead. The sky was starting to lighten at the edges. Morning, approaching in the same steady way it always did. I thought about the money, the reason I had come here. How simple it had felt, how contained. Then I thought about the patterns, the delays, the changes, the way things were no longer repeating exactly. And I realized something that settled into place with the same quiet certainty as the rules had on the first night. This wasn't a job you did until you could leave. It was a system you stayed inside until it no longer needed you to be the same person who entered it. I started the car, drove away, and for the first time, I didn't check the mirrors.